Hello there, you're listening to the planet's memory, where time breathes and the earth remembers. Close your eyes now and let yourself settle into this moment, this quiet space where nothing is required of you except rest. Tonight we are going on a journey together, but it is not a journey that asks anything of you. You do not need to remember facts or follow complex ideas. You do not need to stay alert or keep track of details. This is simply a story, soft and slow, about stones and time and the whispers of people who lived so very long ago. It is a story that will carry you gently towards sleep, like a river carries a leaf, with no effort and no resistance, just a slow and natural drifting into peaceful rest. Imagine for a moment the feeling of standing in an open field at twilight, when the sky is soft and purple and the air is still and cool. Imagine the grass beneath your feet and the quietness all around you, and in the distance, rising from the earth like ancient fingers reaching toward the sky, there are stones, enormous stones, placed there by hands that disappeared thousands of years ago. These stones do not shout, they do not demand. They simply stand, silent and patient, holding secrets that may never be fully understood, and perhaps that is exactly how it should be. Perhaps the mystery itself is the gift, the invitation to wonder without needing answers, to rest in the presence of something larger than ourselves, something that has witnessed the turning of ages and the passing of countless seasons. Tonight we will walk together through the story of these stones, these monuments that dot the surface of our world like punctuation marks in a language we have almost forgotten how to read. We will visit the people who built them, not with excitement or urgency, but with gentle curiosity and a soft kind of reverence. We will wonder together quietly whether these structures were meant as warnings, as messages sent forward through time to reach us here in our own distant future. But we will wander without fear, without alarm, because even if they are warnings wrapped in beauty and mystery, spoken in a language so slow and patient that it asks nothing of us except to listen with our hearts rather than our hurried minds. So let yourself relax now, completely and fully. Let your body sink into whatever supports it. Let your breathing become slow and easy. Let your thoughts begin to scatter and fade like clouds dissolving into a clear sky. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, no one you need to become. For these next hours, you are simply here, safe and warm, while a voice speaks softly about stones and time and the long, long story of human beings trying to speak to the future, trying to leave marks that would last beyond memory, beyond language, beyond the fragile threads of story that connect one generation to the next. Long before any stones were lifted, long before any monuments rose from the earth, there were people who lived in ways we can barely imagine now. They lived in a world that was quieter than ours, darker at night, closer to the rhythms of weather and season and the movements of animals across wide landscapes. These people, our distant ancestors, walked on the same earth we walk on now, but their experience of that earth was so different, so immediate and direct, that it is almost like they lived on another planet entirely. They knew the feel of rain on skin, the smell of smoke and grass, the sound of wind moving through leaves, the taste of food they had gathered with their own hands. They knew hunger and cold and the deep satisfaction of a fire at night. They knew the faces of their children and the voices of their elders and the stories told again and again until they became part of the fabric of memory itself. At some point, perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, perhaps even longer, these people began to notice patterns in the world around them. They noticed that the sun rose in one place and set in another, that the moon changed shape in a rhythm that repeated, that certain stars appeared at certain times and disappeared at others. They noticed that animals moved in patterns, that plants grew and died in cycles, that rivers rose and fell with the seasons. And in noticing these patterns, something shifted inside them. They began to see that the world was not random, not chaotic, but ordered in ways that could be observed and remembered, and passed along to others. This was the beginning of something profound, something that would eventually lead to science and mathematics and all the tools we use today to understand our universe. But in those early days, it was simpler and more intuitive. It was just people watching the sky and the earth and beginning to feel that there was a language hidden in these patterns, a message being spoken slowly across time. These early humans did not have writing. They did not have books or computers or ways to record information outside of their own memories and the memories of their communities. So they learned to remember in ways that we have mostly forgotten. They trained their minds to hold vast amounts of information, to recall stories and songs and lists of names and sequences of stars. They taught their children these same skills, passing knowledge from one generation to the next through speech and song and ritual. And yet, even with these powerful memories, they must have felt the fragility of it all. They must have known that knowledge could be lost, that if a community was scattered or destroyed, if the elders died before teaching the young, entire worlds of understanding could simply vanish as if they had never existed at all. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, the quiet anxiety that must have lived in the hearts of those who held important knowledge. Imagine knowing that you carried in your mind information that could help your people survive. Information about where water could be found in dry seasons, where certain plants grew, how to predict the coming of winter, how to navigate by stars. And imagine knowing that if you died without passing this knowledge on, it would be gone forever, erased as completely as footprints in sand when the tide comes in. Perhaps this is where the first stirrings of monument building began, not in a sudden inspiration, not in a grand plan, but in a slow and growing desire to make knowledge permanent, to fix it in something more lasting than human memory, to write in stone what could not be written in words. In the southeastern part of what is now Turkey, there is a place called Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill in the Turkish language. For thousands of years this hill looked like any other hill, covered with grass and small plants, visited by shepherds and their flocks, unremarkable and quiet under the wide sky. But beneath the surface of this ordinary hill, buried under soil and time, there was something extraordinary, something that would change the way we understand the story of human civilization. In the 1990s, when archaeologists finally began to dig into this hill, they found stones, massive T-shaped pillars carved with images of animals and symbols, arranged in circles like ancient temples or gathering places. And when they dated these stones, when they determined how old they were, the results were almost impossible to believe. These structures were built more than 11,000 years ago, at a time when human beings were not supposed to be building anything at all. According to the story we had told ourselves about human history, people 11,000 years ago were simple hunter-gatherers, moving in small groups across landscapes, following animal herds and seasonal plants, living in temporary shelters, possessing only the most basic tools. The building of permanent structures, the creation of temples and monuments, the development of agriculture and cities, all of this was supposed to come much later, after people had settled down and learned to farm and had the surplus of food and time necessary for such ambitious projects. But Göbekli Tepe did not fit this story. Here were people who were still hunter-gatherers, still moving with the seasons, still living in ways we would consider primitive, and yet they were capable of organizing themselves to quarry and move stones weighing many tons, to carve them with remarkable skill, to arrange them in precise patterns, to create a place that must have been important enough to draw people from great distances. The stones at Göbekli Tepe are beautiful in a strange and haunting way. They stand like silent sentinels, their surfaces covered with images of foxes and snakes and birds and scorpions and other creatures, all rendered with a clarity and attention to detail that speaks of time and care, and a deep knowledge of the natural world. Some of the pillars have arms carved into their sides as if they represent human figures, though their T-shaped heads are abstract and mysterious. Walking among these stones, even now, even thousands of years after they were carved, one can feel something of the presence they must have had when they were new, when the people who made them gathered in these circles to do whatever it was they did here. Were they performing rituals? Were they telling stories? Were they marking the movements of stars or seasons? Were they trying to communicate something important, something they feared might be forgotten if it was not somehow fixed in stone? No one knows the answers to these questions, and perhaps no one ever will. The people who built Göbekli Tepe left no writing, no clear explanations, no guidebooks for future archaeologists. All they left were the stones themselves and the enigma of their existence. And yet, even without understanding precisely what these stones meant, we can feel their weight, their significance, their quiet insistence that we pay attention. There is something here that matters, something that people 11,000 years ago considered important enough to dedicate enormous amounts of time and effort to create. And because it is so old, because it comes from a time before agriculture and cities and all the structures we associate with civilization, it suggests that the impulse to build monuments, to create lasting marks in the landscape, to speak to the future through stone, is older and deeper in the human heart than we ever imagined. Think about the things you create in your own life, the marks you leave in the world around you. Most of what we do is temporary and ephemeral. We speak words that fade into air. We write messages that are deleted or lost. We take photographs that sit in digital files rarely looked at. We buy things that break or wear out or go out of style. We live in houses that will outlast us, but not by much. And even the cities we build, for all their apparent solidity, are constantly being torn down and rebuilt and reshaped. There is something almost frantic about the way modern life moves, as if we are afraid of stillness, afraid of permanence, afraid of the weight of things that cannot be changed or undone. And yet, despite this general atmosphere of impermanence, there are moments when we feel the pull of something different, a desire to create something that will last, to leave a mark that will endure beyond our own brief lives. Perhaps you have felt this when planting a tree, knowing that it will grow and provide shade for people you will never meet. Perhaps you have felt it when writing a letter to someone you love, trying to capture something true that might be read again in years to come. Perhaps you have felt it when looking at old photographs of relatives who have died, feeling the strange power of these frozen moments, these small windows into vanished lives. We are drawn to permanence even as we live in a world of constant change, and this tension is part of what makes us human, part of what drives us to create and preserve and remember. For ancient peoples, this drive must have been even stronger, even more urgent, because they lived closer to death and loss, closer to the constant threat of things disappearing entirely. When a community decides to build something large and permanent, something that requires the labor of many people over long periods of time, there is always a reason, always something they are trying to accomplish or communicate or preserve. Sometimes these monuments are tombs, places to honor the dead and ensure they are remembered. Sometimes they are temples, places to connect with gods or spirits or forces larger than human life. Sometimes they are calendars, tools for tracking the movements of sun and moon and stars, for knowing when to plant and when to harvest, for understanding the rhythms of time itself. And sometimes perhaps they are warnings, messages sent forward to descendants who will live in times the builders could not imagine, trying to tell them something important, something that must not be forgotten even as languages change and cultures transform, and the specific meanings of symbols slip away into obscurity. Imagine the conversations that must have happened before a monument was built. Imagine elders sitting together, talking quietly about what was needed, about what was being lost, about what must be preserved. Imagine them looking at the young people in their community and wondering if these young ones would remember the stories, would carry forward the knowledge that kept everyone safe and alive. Imagine them feeling the weight of time pressing on them, the awareness that their own lives were short and fragile, that memory itself was fragile, that without some kind of physical anchor, something solid and permanent, the knowledge they held might simply evaporate like morning dew when the sun rises. And so they made a decision, a collective decision that would require sacrifice and effort and resources to create something that would outlast memory, that would stand as a physical reminder of what they knew and what they feared and what they hoped. On a flat and windy plain in the south of England, where the grass grows low and the sky feels enormous, there stands one of the most famous stone monuments in the world. Stonehenge has become so familiar through photographs and films and countless descriptions that it is easy to forget how strange and wonderful it actually is, how improbable and mysterious. Imagine seeing it for the first time, coming over a rise in the landscape, and suddenly encountering these massive stones arranged in circles, some standing upright, some fallen, some topped with horizontal stones to form trilithons, giant doorways leading nowhere. The stones are grey and weathered and ancient beyond easy comprehension, and they sit on the plain as if they have always been there, as if they grew from the earth itself rather than being dragged and lifted and placed by human hands. But of course they did not grow there. They were brought from distant places, some from as far as 150 miles away, transported across rivers and hills by people who had no wheels, no machines, no technology, beyond their own muscles and determination and ingenuity. The larger stones, called sarsens, each weigh 25 tons or more, and the effort required to move them, to raise them upright, to fit them together with careful joints and lintels, is almost unimaginable, and yet it happened. Somehow, over many generations, people kept working on this monument, adding to it, modifying it, maintaining it, treating it as something precious and necessary, even though the work was brutally hard and the purpose, at least to us now, is not entirely clear. Stonehenge was built in stages over a period of more than 1,000 years, which means that the people who finished it lived at a time so far removed from the people who started it that they might not have fully understood the original intentions. This is part of what makes ancient monuments so fascinating and so poignant. They represent efforts that span generations, projects that no single person or even single lifetime could complete, collaborative works that required faith in something larger than individual experience. The people who dragged the first stones into place and dug the first ditches knew they would never see the finished monument. They were building for their children and their children's children, trusting that the work would continue, that the vision would be maintained, that the effort would be worth it even if they themselves would never witness the completion. What were they building? What was Stonehenge for? Archaeologists have offered many theories over the years. Some say it was a temple, a place for religious ceremonies tied to the movements of the sun and moon. The alignment of the stones with the summer solstice sunrise is undeniable, and every year people still gather at Stonehenge to watch the sun come up on the longest day, to stand where ancient people stood and feel some connection to that distant past. Others suggest it was a healing place, a kind of prehistoric hospital where people came seeking cures for illnesses drawn by the power they believed the stones possessed. Still others think it was a burial ground for important people, a way of marking the landscape with the presence of ancestors, turning the plain itself into a kind of map of memory and lineage. And then there are those who wonder if Stonehenge was a warning, a marker meant to alert future generations to something important, something that needed to be remembered and respected. Perhaps it marked a sacred boundary, a place that should not be crossed or violated. Perhaps it recorded some event, some catastrophe or transformation that shaped the lives of the people who built it. Perhaps it was a way of saying to the future, remember this, do not forget. This matters in ways that transcend any single generation. Without writing, without clear records, we can only guess, only stand among the stones and let them speak to us in their silent language, hoping that some fragment of their original meaning might still resonate across the enormous gulf of time that separates us from their makers. There is something profound about stone as a medium for memory. Unlike wood, which rots and burns and returns to earth relatively quickly, unlike fabric or paper or the countless organic materials that human beings have used for making and building, stone persists. Stone weathers and cracks and slowly erodes, but it does so on a time scale that is geological rather than human, measured in thousands or millions of years rather than decades or centuries. When you carve something into stone, you are making a commitment to permanence. You are saying that this message, this image, this structure is important enough to outlast language itself, to remain standing even when no one remembers who made it or why. Ancient peoples understood this in ways we have perhaps forgotten. In our modern world, we store information digitally in formats that are incredibly efficient and accessible, but also incredibly fragile. A digital file can be lost in an instant, erased by a computer failure, or made unreadable by the obsolescence of the technology needed to access it. We have already lost vast amounts of early digital information simply because the machines that could read old file formats no longer exist or no longer work. This would have seemed insane to an ancient monument builder. This idea of storing precious knowledge in forms so fragile and temporary. For them, if something was truly important, if it was knowledge that must not be lost, it had to be carved in stone, built into the landscape itself, made so large and obvious that no one could miss it, no one could accidentally lose it or forget where it was. But even stone has its limitations. Stone can preserve the fact that a message was sent, that someone considered something important enough to carve permanently, but it cannot always preserve the meaning of that message. Languages change, symbols shift in significance, cultural contexts disappear. The people who carved images of animals and strange symbols onto the pillars at Göbekli Tepe knew exactly what those images meant, but we can only guess, can only interpret based on what we know about other ancient cultures and what we imagine might have been important to people 11,000 years ago. The message is there, fixed in stone, but it is a message we can only partially read, like a letter written in a language we have almost but not quite forgotten. This is the paradox of monuments. They are meant to communicate across time, to preserve knowledge and memory and warnings for future generations, but they can only do this imperfectly. They can ensure that future people will encounter something, will know that their ancestors considered something important, will be prompted to ask questions and wonder about meanings, but they cannot guarantee that those future people will understand, will correctly interpret, will receive the message as it was intended. And yet, despite this limitation, perhaps the attempt itself has value. Perhaps there is something meaningful in the act of reaching toward the future, of trying to speak across the enormous silence of centuries and millennia, even if the words get garbled, even if the message becomes ambiguous, even if all that remains is a sense that something was being said, something that mattered to people who are now dust and memory. In the desert lands of Egypt, where the Nile flows through endless sand and the sun beats down with relentless intensity, there stand the pyramids, monuments so enormous and so precisely constructed that they have puzzled and amazed people for thousands of years. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, is one of the largest structures ever created by human hands. It was built from more than 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing several tons, fitted together with such precision that even now, after more than 4,000 years of weathering and earthquakes and the ravages of time, the blocks still fit so tightly that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them in many places. The effort required to build such a structure is almost beyond comprehension. For more than 20 years, thousands of workers laboured on this single pyramid, quarrying stone, transporting it to the building site, lifting it into place one block at a time, layer upon layer, until the structure rose nearly 500 feet into the air, dominating the landscape visible from miles away in every direction. These workers were not slaves, as was once believed, but skilled labourers and craftsmen who were paid in food and goods, who lived in workers' villages near the construction sites, who took pride in their contribution to this massive project. They were building something that would last forever, something that would speak of the power and sophistication of their civilization, something that would ensure their pharaoh's journey to the afterlife was properly honoured and supported. But the pyramids were more than just tombs. They were also calendars and astronomical observatories, aligned with remarkable precision to the cardinal directions and to certain stars that were significant in Egyptian mythology and cosmology. The ancient Egyptians were deeply concerned with the movements of the heavens, with the rising and setting of stars, with the flooding of the Nile which brought life to their desert civilization. They understood that these celestial events followed patterns, and they built their monuments to reflect and honor these patterns, to connect earth and sky, human life and cosmic order. The pyramids were a way of saying that their civilization understood its place in the universe, that they were not just random people living random lives, but part of a larger pattern, a cosmic story that connected the gods and the stars and the river and the land and the people all together in one grand eternal dance. Looking at the pyramids now, one cannot help but feel a sense of awe and also a sense of sadness. These structures have outlasted the civilization that built them by thousands of years. Pharaohs who were buried in them are long dead, their bodies preserved as mummies, but their power and authority vanished completely. The workers who built them, whose names we do not know, whose faces we will never see, have been dust for millennia. The language they spoke is no longer spoken. The gods they worshipped are no longer worshipped. The entire world they knew has disappeared, swept away by the relentless movement of time and history and change. And yet the pyramids remain, still standing, still precise, still enigmatic, asking us to remember something, to acknowledge something, to consider what it means that these things were built, that people cared enough about permanence and legacy and communication with the future to dedicate so much of their lives to creating these monuments. Were the pyramids warnings? In the traditional sense, probably not. They were not trying to tell future generations to avoid some danger or remember some catastrophe. They were expressions of power and religious belief and cultural identity. But in a broader sense, perhaps all monuments are warnings of a sort. They warn us about the passage of time, about the inevitability of change, about the fragility of civilizations that seem permanent when you are living in them but turn out to be just temporary episodes in the much longer story of human existence. They warn us to think carefully about what we build and why, about what we want to leave behind, about whether the things we consider important will seem important to people living in times we cannot imagine. People who will look back at us the way we look back at ancient Egyptians, with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension and wonder. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continental coast, there is a small island called Rapa Nui, though most people know it by its European name, Easter Island. This remote speck of land, barely 64 square miles in total area, is home to one of the most mysterious and haunting collections of monuments in the world. Scattered across the island, along its coasts and on its slopes, there stand hundreds of massive stone statues called moai, carved from volcanic rock, some of them reaching 30 feet in height and weighing as much as 80 tons. These figures are instantly recognizable, with their elongated faces, their heavy brows, their thin lips, their long ears, their bodies that are mostly torso with small legs often buried in the ground. They stare inland, their backs to the sea, watching over the island with expressions that are both serene and stern, as if they are guarding something, protecting something, or perhaps warning about something. The people who carved these moai were Polynesians who arrived on the island sometime around 1200 CE. sailing across vast stretches of open ocean in canoes, navigating by stars and currents and the flight patterns of birds, carrying with them the plants and animals and knowledge they would need to establish a new home in this isolated place. When they arrived, Easter Island was covered with palm forests, rich with birds, surrounded by waters full of fish. It must have seemed like a paradise, a perfect place to build a new society. And build they did, developing a complex culture with chiefs and priests and craftsmen, creating a written script that no one has been able to fully decipher, and most famously carving and erecting these enormous stone statues that would come to define the island's identity. But something went wrong. Over the centuries following settlement, the population of Easter Island grew, and as it grew, the demands on the island's resources increased. Trees were cut down to clear land for agriculture, to provide timber for building and tools, and to create rollers for moving the massive moai from the quarries where they were carved to the coastal platforms where they were erected. Slowly, gradually, the forests disappeared. Without trees to hold the soil, erosion increased. Without wood for boats, fishing became more difficult. Without the resources that had once been abundant, competition and conflict intensified. By the time European explorers arrived in the 1700s, they found an island largely barren of trees, a population that had declined dramatically, and many moai that had been toppled, pushed over in what seems to have been deliberate destruction, perhaps during warfare between different clans or groups on the island. The story of Easter Island has often been told as a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when a society overexploits its environment, when people fail to recognize the limits of their resources until it is too late. The moai themselves, in this interpretation, become symbols of misplaced priorities of a culture that devoted enormous energy to creating monuments, while neglecting the ecological foundations that supported their society. Whether this interpretation is entirely fair or accurate is debated by scholars, some of whom argue that the collapse was more complex and involved factors like introduced rats that ate palm seeds and prevented forest regeneration, or European diseases that decimated the population. But regardless of the precise historical details, the image of these statues standing on a barren island, their makers long gone, their purpose no longer fulfilled, their presence now more melancholic than triumphant, speaks powerfully to something in the human experience. Perhaps the moai were not intended as warnings when they were made. Perhaps they were simply meant to honor ancestors, to represent chiefs or important figures, to embody the mana or spiritual power that was so central to Polynesian culture. But they have become warnings nonetheless, symbols that remind us to think about sustainability, about the long-term consequences of our actions, about the danger of pursuing grand projects without considering whether the foundations supporting those projects are solid or slowly eroding away. They stand now in silence, weathered by wind and rain, surrounded by grass and sky, and they watch over an island that is no longer what it was, asking us to wonder, quietly, what we are building in our own time, and what those who come after us will find when we are gone. In the southern coastal plain of Peru, in a desert so dry that rain almost never falls, there are lines drawn on the ground, enormous lines and shapes and figures that stretch across miles of landscape. These are the Nazca lines, created by people who lived in the region between 500 BCE and 500 CE, made by removing the reddish pebbles that cover the desert floor to reveal the lighter coloured ground beneath. From up close, from ground level, these lines are not particularly impressive. They look like paths or clearings, stretches of lighter ground cutting across the darker desert surface. But from above, from the air, they resolve into clear patterns, straight lines running for miles with perfect precision, geometric shapes including triangles and trapezoids and spirals, and most famously enormous figures representing animals and plants. A spider and a monkey and a hummingbird and a whale and many others, each one drawn with a single continuous line that never crosses itself, each one so large that it can only be properly seen from high above. The mystery of the Nazca lines is not how they were made, which is relatively straightforward given enough time and planning, but why they were made and for whom. The people who created these lines could not see them as we see them from airplanes. They could not appreciate the full scope and beauty of the designs they were making. So why did they invest so much effort in creating images that could only be fully perceived by someone flying overhead? Something they could not do and had no reason to think anyone else would ever do. Over the years, people have suggested many theories. Some thought the lines were astronomical calendars, pointing to the rising and setting of stars or marking solstices and equinoxes. Others suggested they were pathways for religious processions, sacred routes walked during ceremonies and rituals. Still others, more fancifully, claimed they were landing strips for ancient astronauts or messages to extraterrestrial visitors. The most likely explanations are more grounded but no less interesting. The lines probably had multiple functions, some serving as sight lines to mountains and water sources, which were sacred in Andean cosmology, some marking the underground flow of water in this desperately dry landscape, some creating spaces for ceremonies and gatherings, some expressing beliefs and stories central to the culture that made them. The animal figures were probably offerings to the gods, or representations of constellation patterns, or symbols of myths and legends that everyone in that culture would have recognized immediately. The act of making the lines, the walking and working and maintaining them, may have been as important as the finished product, a way of connecting with the land and with the sacred forces that sustained life in such a harsh environment. But there is something haunting about these lines nonetheless, something that makes them feel like messages or warnings sent forward through time. They have lasted for more than 1,000 years in this desert where nothing grows and nothing changes, protected by the very dryness that makes the region so inhospitable. They are fragile in one sense, just surface marks that could be erased by farming or construction or even by too many people walking on them. Yet they have survived when so many other human creations have vanished. They remind us that the human need to make marks, to create patterns, to impose order and meaning on the landscape is ancient and deep and persistent. They remind us that we do not fully understand the minds and hearts of people from the past, that their reasons for doing things may have made perfect sense to them, but seem strange or inexplicable to us. And they ask us to consider what marks we are making on our own landscape, what patterns we are creating that future people will look at and wonder about, and whether those people will be able to understand why we did what we did, or whether they will be as puzzled by our creations as we are by the spider and the monkey drawn in the Peruvian desert. Stonehenge is the most famous stone circle in the world, but it is far from the only one. Across Europe, particularly in the western regions where ancient populations were dense and cultures were complex, there are thousands of megalithic monuments, standing stones and stone circles and passage tombs and dolmens, scattered across the landscape like punctuation in a language we have mostly forgotten. In Britain and Ireland alone, there are hundreds of stone circles, ranging from small rings with just a few stones to massive constructions rivaling Stonehenge in ambition and scope. There are single standing stones called menhirs, some of them reaching 20 feet or more in height, planted in the ground like markers or signposts, pointing to something unknown. There are dolmens, structures made of several upright stones supporting a massive capstone, creating a kind of stone table or chamber, often used as burial sites. The distribution of these monuments suggests that the people who built them were part of a widespread cultural tradition, communities that shared beliefs and practices and ways of thinking about the world and the sacred and the relationship between the living and the dead. Building these monuments required organization and cooperation and a shared sense of purpose. It required people to come together, to agree on where a monument should be placed, how it should be constructed, what it should be represent. And because the same basic forms appear across such vast distances, from Portugal to Scotland, from France to Denmark, It seems that these ideas were travelling, being shared and adapted and passed along through trade routes and migrations, and the slow diffusion of cultural practices that happens when different groups of people interact over long periods of time. Many of these monuments are aligned with astronomical events. Stone circles often have sight lines that point to the rising or setting sun on solstices or equinoxes. Passage tombs like Newgrange in Ireland are constructed so that the interior chamber is illuminated by the rising sun on the winter solstice. Just once a year, for a few minutes, a beam of light penetrating deep into the darkness of the tomb. This concern with astronomy, with tracking the movements of sun and moon and stars, suggests that ancient peoples were deeply aware of time, of cycles, of the patterns that govern their lives. The changing seasons were not abstractions to them, but matters of life and death, determining when to plant and when to harvest, when game animals would be available, when the weather would be favourable or dangerous. Being able to predict these changes, to know with certainty when the days would start getting longer again after the depth of winter, was valuable knowledge, knowledge worth preserving, worth building monuments to track and celebrate and ensure it was never lost. But these monuments were also about memory and continuity and connection to ancestors. Many of them contain burials or were built over earlier burial sites. They were places where the living could come to feel close to the dead, to remember those who had passed, to honour their contributions and keep their memory alive. In cultures without writing, memory was maintained through oral tradition and through physical places that served as anchors for stories. The standing stone might mark the place where a battle was fought, or where a chief was buried, or where something important happened. A stone circle might be the place where seasonal gatherings occurred, where marriages were celebrated, where disputes were settled, where the community came together to renew its bonds and remember its shared history. These monuments transformed the landscape into a kind of archive, a physical record of human meaning and memory, ensuring that important places remained important across generations, that the knowledge of what happened where was not lost even as individual memories faded. In this way, these standing stones functioned as warnings in a broad sense. They warned against forgetting, against losing track of important knowledge, against severing the connection with the past. They said, remember this place, remember what happened here, remember the people who came before you, remember that you are part of a story that is much longer than your own life. And they said it in stone, in the most permanent way the builders knew, so that even if the specific stories were forgotten, even if the exact meanings were lost, the markers would remain, prompting future generations to ask questions, to wonder, to feel the weight of the past pressing gently on the present. Pyramids are not unique to Egypt. All across the world, in cultures that had no contact with each other, that developed independently and in isolation, people built pyramids. In Central America, the Maya and Aztec civilizations constructed massive stepped pyramids, temples rising in tiers toward the sky, topped with shrines where priests performed rituals and sacrifices. In South America, the Moche and other Andean cultures built enormous adobe pyramids, made not of stone but of millions of mud bricks, structures that have eroded over centuries but still dominate their landscapes. In Southeast Asia and China, there are pyramid-like structures and enormous mounds and burial complexes that echo the same basic form. Even in North America, the Mississippian culture built large earthen mounds, shaped into pyramids and platforms. Why did so many different cultures, separated by oceans and vast distances and thousands of years, independently decide that the pyramid was the right shape for their most important monuments? Part of the answer is structural. A pyramid is an inherently stable shape. If you want to build something very tall using stone or earth, a pyramid is one of the most practical forms because the base is wide and the structure tapers as it rises, distributing weight in a way that resists collapse. But the universal appearance of pyramids suggests something more than just engineering practicality. There seems to be something about the pyramid shape that resonates with the human mind, something that feels right, or significant or symbolically powerful. Perhaps it is the way a pyramid reaches toward the sky while remaining firmly rooted in the earth, creating a connection between ground and heavens, between the human realm and the realm of gods or spirits or ancestors. Perhaps it is the way a pyramid can be seen from great distances, dominating the landscape, serving as a landmark and a focal point, drawing the eye and the attention, making it clear that this place is special, important, sacred. Perhaps it is the simplicity and elegance of the form, the clean lines and geometric purity that feel orderly and intentional and meaningful in a way that irregular or organic shapes do not. Or perhaps it is all of these things together, a combination of practical and aesthetic and symbolic factors that made the pyramid the natural choice for cultures trying to create monuments that would last forever and communicate importance across time. The builders of these pyramids across the world shared certain concerns even if they never met and never communicated. They all wanted to honor their dead, particularly important leaders and rulers who were believed to have special power or divine connections. They all wanted to create places for religious ceremonies, spaces that felt separated from ordinary life, elevated both literally and metaphorically toward the sacred. They all wanted to demonstrate the power and organization and sophistication of their societies to show that they could marshal the resources and labor necessary for such ambitious projects. And they all wanted to leave something permanent, something that would outlast them, something that would speak to future generations about who they were and what they valued. When we look at these pyramids now, scattered across continents, built by people who never knew each other existed, we see something profound about human nature. We see that the impulse to build, to create permanence, to reach towards something transcendent, is not culturally specific but universally human. We see that people everywhere and in every time have struggled with the same questions about meaning and mortality and memory and legacy. And we see that the answers they came up with, while varied in detail, share common threads, common shapes, common gestures toward the future. The pyramids are not warnings in any explicit sense, but they warn us nonetheless about the limitations of thinking we are unique or unprecedented, about the hubris of believing that our civilization is fundamentally different from all those that came before. They remind us that we are part of a long pattern of humans trying to make sense of existence and leave marks that matter, and that this pattern is both humbling and beautiful. There are cities in the world that no one lives in anymore, places that were once busy and full of life and activity, that thrived for centuries or even millennia, and then for various reasons were abandoned, left empty, allowed to be reclaimed by jungle or desert or time. These abandoned cities are monuments of a different sort, not intentionally built to be monuments, but becoming monuments through the fact of their abandonment, through the way they stand now as testaments to the rise and fall of civilizations, to the impermanence of even the most impressive human achievements. In the jungles of Central America, there are Maya cities, enormous complexes of pyramids and palaces and plazas, covered now by vegetation, silent except for the sounds of birds and insects and rain. These cities were once powerful and populous, centers of sophisticated cultures with advanced knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and writing. The Maya developed a complex calendar system, built observatories to track the movements of planets, created hieroglyphic writing that recorded their history and mythology and achievements. And yet, sometime around 900 CE, many of the great Maya cities were abandoned. People left for reasons that are still debated by scholars. Perhaps it was drought and environmental degradation. Perhaps it was warfare and political collapse. Perhaps it was disease or social upheaval, or a combination of many factors. Whatever the cause, the result was that these magnificent cities, built with such effort and skill, were simply left behind, the forests slowly growing over them, hiding them so completely that some were not rediscovered until the 19th or 20th century. In Cambodia there is Angkor, once the capital of the Khmer Empire, a vast complex of temples and structures centered around the magnificent Angkor Wat, one of the largest religious monuments ever built. For hundreds of years, Angkor was a thriving metropolis, home to perhaps 1 million people at its peak, a center of culture and religion and power. And then it too was abandoned, gradually and then completely, as political power shifted and resources dwindled, and the elaborate systems of reservoirs and canals that supplied water to the city fell into disrepair. The jungle moved in, trees growing through temple walls, roots cracking stone, vines covering intricate carvings. When French explorers encountered Angkor in the 19th century, they found it silent and empty and overgrown, a ghost city haunted by the memory of its former glory. These abandoned cities are warnings of the most powerful kind. They do not warn about specific dangers or events. They warn about something more fundamental, the fragility of civilization itself. They show us that even the most advanced societies, even the most impressive cities, even the most confident and powerful empires are not permanent. They can fall. They can be abandoned. They can disappear into jungle or sand, forgotten for centuries, their names lost, their languages unspoken, their gods unworshipped. And when we walk through these ruins now, when we climb the pyramids and explore the palaces and try to imagine what life was like when these places were alive with people, we cannot help but wonder about our own cities, our own civilizations, our own confident assumption that what we have built will last. One of the difficulties in creating monuments that will communicate across vast stretches of time is that time itself works against understanding. Languages change, symbols shift in meaning, cultures transform. Events that seem monumentally important to one generation become footnotes or curiosities to later generations, and eventually, if enough time passes, they are forgotten entirely. The ancient Egyptians were confident that their civilization would last forever, that the pyramids would always be understood as tombs for pharaohs, that their hieroglyphic writing would always be read and their gods always worshipped. And yet, by the time of the Romans, Egyptian civilization was already ancient history, exotic and mysterious, and the ability to read hieroglyphs was being lost. By the Middle Ages, no one could read them at all. The pyramids were still there, still impressive, but their meaning had become opaque, the subject of wild speculation and myth. It took the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, with its text in 3 scripts, including hieroglyphics in Greek, to finally allow modern scholars to crack the code and begin reading Egyptian writing again. But this was after more than 1,000 years of silence. 1,000 years during which the voices of the ancient Egyptians were mute, their stories untold, their warnings and wisdom and complaints and celebrations, all locked away in symbols that looked like pictures but meant nothing to anyone alive. This is the challenge of deep time. No matter how carefully you craft a message, no matter how permanent a medium you choose, there is no guarantee that anyone in the distant future will be able to understand what you are trying to say. This problem is not just academic, it has very practical implications for our own time. We are currently facing the challenge of how to warn future generations about nuclear waste storage sites. Radioactive materials remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years, far longer than any human civilization has ever lasted, far longer than any language has remained stable, or any symbol has retained consistent meaning. How do you create a warning that will still be understood 10,000 years from now, or 50,000 years from now, by people who may be so different from us that they do not think the way we think or value the things we value? How do you say danger in a language that transcends culture and time? Various proposals have been made. Some suggest creating landscapes of thorns, fields of black stone spikes radiating outward from the waste site, creating a visceral sense of unease and danger, without needing to rely on any specific cultural knowledge. Others propose using redundancy, communicating the warning in multiple media and multiple languages and multiple symbolic systems, hoping that even if most of them become incomprehensible, at least some might get through. Still others suggest creating permanent institutions, something like a priesthood or a tradition, that would be responsible for maintaining the warning and updating the language and symbols as cultures change, ensuring continuity of message even as the specific form of the message evolves. But all of these approaches have weaknesses. Landscapes can be altered or reinterpreted. Multiple redundant messages can all become equally incomprehensible if enough time passes. Institutions can collapse or transform or lose sight of their original purpose. The ancient monument builders faced this same problem, though perhaps they did not fully realize it. They created structures meant to last forever and to communicate important meanings, but they could not anticipate the loss of their languages, the transformation of their cultures, the complete overthrow of their world views. They did their best with the knowledge and resources they had, and the result is that we now have monuments whose physical presence is undeniable, but whose meanings are partially or completely lost, monuments that prompt questions rather than providing answers, that create mystery rather than clarity. And perhaps there is a lesson in this, a humble recognition that perfect communication across deep time is impossible, that all we can do is our best, knowing that future generations will interpret and misinterpret and wonder and speculate, and that this too is part of the human story, this endless effort to understand the past and learn from it, and connect with those who came before. When you stand in front of an ancient monument, whether it is Stonehenge or a Maya pyramid or a standing stone in a Scottish field, you are experiencing something complex and layered. You are seeing the physical object itself, the stone shaped and placed by human hands thousands of years ago. You are feeling the presence of deep time, the awareness that this thing has been standing here far longer than you have been alive, longer than your country has existed, longer than your language has been spoken. You are sensing the echo of human intention, the knowledge that this was made for a reason, that it meant something important to someone, even if you do not know exactly what, and you are engaging in the act of interpretation, trying to read meaning from shape and placement and alignment, trying to hear what the stones are saying even though they speak in silence. Different people hear different things. An archaeologist might hear information about ancient construction techniques, about social organization and labor systems and trade routes. A historian might hear stories about the rise and fall of cultures, about how people lived and what they believed and how they understood their place in the universe. A spiritual person might hear something more mystical, a sense of sacred presence or connection to ancestors or alignment with cosmic forces. A tourist might simply hear the call of something exotic and old and worth travelling to see. All of these hearings are valid in their way. All of them are attempts to bridge the gap between past and present, to make meaning from what remains, to honour the effort and intention of the people who built these things by paying attention to them, by caring that they exist, by allowing them to affect our thoughts and feelings. But perhaps what we hear most clearly from these monuments across all the noise of specific interpretations and theories and debates is something very simple and very profound. The fact that we are not the first people to worry about time and memory and whether anything we do will matter in the long run. The ancient monument builders were struggling with the same anxieties we struggle with today. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their knowledge to survive. They wanted to create something that would outlast their fragile bodies and their vulnerable communities. They wanted to speak to the future, to reach across the centuries and say, we were here, we mattered, we knew things, we tried to preserve what was important. And in that sense, the monuments have succeeded, not necessarily in transmitting specific information or warnings, but in transmitting the emotional and existential reality of being human, of facing mortality and impermanence, and the slow erosion of all things. This is perhaps the real warning that ancient monuments give us. They warn us that time wins. They warn us that everything eventually crumbles and fades and is forgotten. They warn us that even the most impressive achievements, the pyramids and stone circles and great cities, cannot escape the relentless movement of time. But they also show us something beautiful and defiant in the face of that truth. They show us that knowing time wins does not stop us from trying. They show us that humans have always reached for permanence, even while knowing deep down that permanence is impossible. They show us that the effort itself, the reaching, the building, the carving, the careful placement of stones with intention and meaning, is valuable regardless of whether it ultimately succeeds in preserving what it was meant to preserve. If ancient monuments are warnings, what exactly are they warning us about? Different people have suggested different answers to this question. Some believe the warnings are environmental, reminders of what happens when a society uses up its resources without thinking about sustainability, like the moai on Easter Island standing over a deforested landscape. Some think the warnings are about cosmic cycles, about catastrophes that occur periodically and need to be remembered so that future generations can prepare or at least understand what is happening when it happens again. Some imagine the warnings are about spiritual or moral truths, lessons about how to live in harmony with each other and with the earth, encoded in stone because they are too important to risk losing. But perhaps the question itself is too narrow. Perhaps we should ask not what the monuments are warning us about specifically, but why human beings feel the need to warn future generations at all. What drives this impulse? Why do we care what happens to people we will never meet? People who will live in times we cannot imagine. People who may be so different from us that they would not even recognize us as kin. One answer is that it is an expression of hope, a way of asserting that the future matters, that there will be a future, that humanity will continue even though individuals die. When you build a monument intended to last thousands of years, you are implicitly betting that there will be people around in thousands of years to see it. You are expressing faith in continuity and the ongoing story of human existence, even if you cannot know the specific shape that story will take. Another answer is that it is an expression of responsibility, a recognition that our actions have consequences that extend beyond our own lifetimes. We affect the future whether we intend to or not, through the way we use resources, through the knowledge we preserve or lose, through the structures we build and the landscapes we alter. If we know that we are creating conditions that future generations will have to live with, then perhaps we have an obligation to try to communicate with them, to give them whatever information or guidance we can, to at least make the attempt to help even if we cannot be sure our help will be understood or useful. And a third answer is that it is an expression of love, strange as that might sound when talking about monuments built for unknown people in unimaginable futures. But there is a kind of love in caring about the welfare of others simply because they are human, because they will face challenges and sorrows and joys and mysteries, because they will wonder about their origins and their purpose and their place in the universe just as we do. Building a monument for the future is a way of reaching out across time and saying, "You are not alone. You are connected to those who came before. We thought about you even though we never knew you. We tried to leave something for you." And that gesture, that reaching out, is fundamentally an act of love, a refusal to see human existence as isolated moments disconnected from each other, an insistence that we are all part of one long continuous story. In many places around the world, there are large hills or small mountains that look natural, but may actually be human-made, or at least human-modified. These are some of the most enigmatic monuments because they can be difficult to identify as monuments at all. Vegetation covers them completely. Erosion has worn away sharp edges. They blend into the landscape so successfully that they look like ordinary features of the terrain. And yet, beneath the soil and roots there may be structures, pyramids or platforms or burial mounds built long ago and then abandoned, left to be reclaimed by nature until they look like they were never anything other than natural hills. Silbury Hill in England is an example of this phenomenon. It is the largest prehistoric human-made mound in Europe, a massive structure standing over 100 feet high and covering more than 5 acres at its base. It was built around 2400 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt, though it looks nothing like a pyramid. It looks like a large, smooth, conical hill covered in grass. For centuries, no one knew it was human-made. It was just a hill. Only through excavation and investigation did archaeologists discover that it was constructed in layers, built up over time with chalk rubble and earth, a monument of enormous scale that took thousands of hours of labour to create. And yet, despite all the investigation and analysis, no one knows why it was built. There are no burials in it. There are no obvious alignments with astronomical events. It does not seem to have any practical purpose. It is simply there, a massive effort frozen in earth, a question mark rising from the landscape. There may be many more structures like Silbury Hill, hills that we assume are natural but are actually ancient monuments, so old and so thoroughly reclaimed by nature that we do not recognize them for what they are. In Bosnia, there is a controversial claim that a mountain called Visočica is actually a pyramid, modified by ancient peoples into a geometric shape and then covered by soil and vegetation over millennia. Most archaeologists are skeptical, arguing that the geological evidence does not support the idea that the mountain is naturally shaped and just happens to have sides that seem symmetrical. But the controversy itself is interesting because it highlights how difficult it can be to tell the difference between natural and human-made features when enough time has passed. If a monument is old enough, if it has been abandoned long enough, nature will do its work, covering and softening and transforming, until the monument no longer looks like a monument, until it has become part of the landscape, indistinguishable from features that were never touched by human hands. This blurring of the line between nature and monument is both troubling and oddly comforting. It is troubling because it means we may be missing important sites, may be walking past monuments without recognizing them, may be losing knowledge and understanding simply because we do not realize there is something there to be understood. But it is also comforting because it shows that the earth reclaims things, that even our most ambitious constructions will eventually be softened and integrated back into the natural world, that the distinction between human and nature is not as sharp as we sometimes imagine. The monuments return to the earth that provided the materials to make them. The warnings, if that is what they are, become whispered rather than shouted, subtle rather than obvious, requiring careful attention and investigation to detect. Not all monuments are large structures of stone raised up from the ground. Some are marks on existing stone, images carved or painted onto cliff faces and canyon walls, and the sides of caves. These rock art sites exist all over the world, in every inhabited continent, created by different cultures across thousands of years. Some of the oldest date back more than 40,000 years, made by people whose names we will never know, whose languages are lost, whose stories have vanished except for these images frozen on stone. The images vary widely. There are handprints, perhaps the most personal and direct mark a person can leave, the outline of their own hand pressed against stone and paint blown around it, saying in the simplest possible way, "I was here, I existed." There are animals, the creatures that shared the world with these ancient artists, rendered sometimes with extraordinary realism and sometimes as stylized or abstract forms. There are hunting scenes and dancing figures and geometric patterns and strange symbols whose meanings are completely opaque to us now. There are scenes that seem to depict ceremonies or rituals, figures that might be shamans or spirits, images that hint at beliefs and practices and ways of seeing the world that we can only guess at. What were these artists trying to do? Were they creating art for its own sake, for beauty or expression or the joy of making? Were they performing magical acts, believing that painting an animal gave them power over it or ensured success in hunting? Were they recording events, keeping track of important hunts or battles or changes in the world around them? Were they teaching, leaving instructions or warnings or knowledge for others to find? Were they communicating with spirits or gods or ancestors, using the rock surfaces as portals or interfaces with invisible realms? All of these interpretations have been suggested, and probably all of them contain some truth. Rock art likely served multiple purposes, different in different contexts, layered with meanings that were obvious to the makers but are mysterious to us. But one thing seems clear: these images were meant to last. The artist chose locations that were protected from the worst weathering, places where the rock face was sheltered by overhangs or positioned in ways that kept it relatively dry. They used pigments and techniques that adhered strongly to the stone. They returned to the same sites over generations, adding new images, maintaining old ones, creating palimpsests of art where different time periods overlap. This suggests intention, a desire not just to make something for the moment, but to create something permanent, something that would remain, something that others would see and recognize as important, even if the specific meanings became unclear. These rock art sites are warnings in the same way that all ancient monuments are warnings. They remind us that humans have always tried to communicate across time, to leave marks, to say something that outlasts a single lifetime. They show us the universality of this impulse, the way it appears independently in cultures that had no contact with each other, from Australian Aborigines to Native Americans to European cave painters to African rock artists. And they humble us by showing us how much can be lost, how images that once had clear and powerful meanings can become riddles, how the voices of the past can be silenced even when their art remains visible. The carvings and paintings are still there, still vivid in many cases, still beautiful and mysterious and haunting, but they are only half of what they once were. The other half, the context and stories and meanings, has evaporated like water in desert sun, leaving only the marks on stone and our endless wondering about what they meant. There is something poignant about ancient monuments, something that evokes a deep and quiet sadness even as we admire their beauty and ambition. Perhaps it is the loneliness of them, the way they stand now without the communities that gave them meaning, without the ceremonies and stories and daily life that once surrounded them. A stone circle is not just stones. It was a place where people gathered, where they celebrated festivals and conducted rituals and made decisions and connected with each other and with whatever they considered sacred. It was alive with sound and movement and meaning. But now it is silent. The people are gone. The festivals are no longer celebrated. The rituals are no longer performed. The meanings have faded or disappeared. The stones remain, but they are lonely monuments to themselves, marking the absence of what they once were part of. This loneliness is even more pronounced at sites that have been abandoned and forgotten and then rediscovered. When explorers found the Maya cities in the jungle, when they pushed through dense vegetation and suddenly encountered pyramids and palaces and plazas that no one had visited for centuries, they experienced something surreal and melancholic. These were cities built for thousands of people, designed as centers of power and culture, filled once with the noise and bustle and complexity of urban life. And now they were empty, inhabited only by monkeys and parrots, their plazas overgrown, their buildings crumbling, their grandeur slowly being dismantled by roots and rain. The explorers must have felt like they were walking through a dream or perhaps a nightmare, seeing all this human effort and achievement reduced to ruins, seeing the silence where there had once been so much life. We try to counter this loneliness through preservation and tourism and scholarship. We excavate sites and restore structures and create museums and interpretation centers. We invite people to visit, to walk where the ancients walked, to learn about the cultures that built these monuments. We study and analyze and debate and write books and articles, trying to recover as much understanding as possible, trying to hear the voices that have been silent for so long. And these are good efforts, valuable efforts. They show that we care, that we recognize these monuments as part of our shared human heritage, that we want to honor the people who built them by paying attention and trying to understand. But there is a limit to how much we can recover. We cannot bring back the communities that are gone. We cannot recreate the living cultures that gave these monuments their original meanings. We cannot undo the passage of time that has separated us from the builders by such vast distances. And so the monuments remain lonely in a fundamental sense, stranded in time, cut off from their origins, speaking a language that we can only partially translate. And perhaps this is simply how it must be. Perhaps this loneliness is an inevitable consequence of time and change, something we should acknowledge and accept, rather than pretend we can fix. The monuments are survivors of a sort, outlasting everything else, but survival comes at a cost. And the cost is this disconnection, this silence, this quality of being remnants rather than living presences. When we think about ancient monuments and what they might be trying to warn us about, it is natural to turn the question back on ourselves and ask what monuments we are building, what messages we are building, what messages we are sending to the future, what warnings we might need to leave for generations to come. And the answer is complicated because we are building many things, some intentional and some accidental, some physical and some less tangible. And not all of them are things we would choose to leave behind if we thought carefully about legacy and long-term consequences. We are building cities, enormous sprawling metropolises that house millions of people, complex networks of buildings and roads and infrastructure, systems for moving water and energy and information. These cities are impressive in many ways, testaments to our organizational and technological capabilities, monuments to modern civilization just as much as pyramids were monuments to ancient civilizations. But they are also fragile, dependent on constant maintenance and energy inputs, vulnerable to disruptions in the systems that keep them functioning. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, if the electricity stopped flowing and the supply chains broke down and the people left, these cities would begin to decay almost immediately. Buildings would leak and rust and crumble. Roads would crack and buckle. Plants would begin to reclaim spaces. Within decades, within a century at most, modern cities would start to look like ruins. And within a few centuries, they might be as difficult to interpret as Maya cities are for us now. We are building waste, enormous quantities of it, from plastic that does not biodegrade, to nuclear materials that remain dangerous for millennia, to carbon dioxide and other gases that alter the atmosphere and will affect climate for centuries or longer. These are not monuments we intended to build. We did not set out to create mountains of garbage or radioactive storage sites or a changed climate. These are byproducts, consequences of the way we have chosen to live, and yet they will be among the most lasting marks we leave on the planet. Long after our cities have crumbled, long after our art and literature and all the things we take pride in have been lost or forgotten, the waste will remain, altering ecosystems, affecting the lives of humans and other species, serving as an unintentional monument to our appetites and our short-sightedness. We are building knowledge, vast libraries of information stored digitally, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, encompassing everything from scientific research to personal photographs to mundane records of transactions and communications. This knowledge is more extensive and more detailed than any previous civilization has ever possessed. We know more about the world, about history, about ourselves, than humans have ever known before. But this knowledge is also incredibly fragile, stored in formats that could become unreadable, dependent on technologies that could become obsolete, vulnerable to being lost if electrical grids fail, or if there are catastrophic disruptions. We have made no serious effort to preserve this knowledge in truly permanent form, to carve it in stone or encode it in something that will last thousands of years. We trust that the systems will continue, that someone will always be able to read our files and access our databases, but this trust may be misplaced. Future archaeologists trying to understand our civilization may find themselves in the same position we are in trying to understand ancient cultures, surrounded by remnants and fragments but unable to access the fuller picture because the primary records have vanished. Is it ethical to try to send messages to the future? Is it responsible to build monuments that will last thousands of years and impose their presence on landscapes that future peoples will inherit? These might seem like strange questions. We generally think of monuments as good things, as efforts to preserve knowledge and memory, as gifts to future generations. But there is another way to look at it. Every monument is also an imposition, a constraint on the future, a choice made by past people that affects the options available to those who come later. When the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, they were dedicating enormous resources to projects that their descendants might not have chosen to prioritize. When cultures built permanent stone structures, they were altering landscapes in ways that became difficult or impossible to undo. The stones are still there, and future generations have to work around them or with them, have to decide whether to preserve them or remove them, or simply leave them alone. This is particularly relevant when thinking about monuments as warnings. If we build something to warn future generations about a danger, about nuclear waste or climate change or any other long-term threat, we are making assumptions about what will be important to them, about what they will need to know, about how they will think, and what they will value. And we might be wrong. We might be warning about something that turns out not to be a problem, or that they handle easily with technologies we cannot imagine, or that is completely irrelevant to the challenges they actually face. We might be cluttering their landscapes with warnings about our problems, while failing to address or even anticipate the problems that will matter to them. There is also the question of paternalism. When we try to send messages to the future, we are positioning ourselves as the wise elders, the ones who know things that future people need to learn, the teachers instructing the students. But future people may be much smarter than us, may understand things we cannot grasp, may look back at our warnings the way we look back at medieval superstitions, with a mixture of amusement and pity. They may not want our advice. They may not need our warnings. They may resent our assumption that they are incapable of figuring things out for themselves. The monuments we build with the best intentions could end up being seen as arrogant impositions, attempts by primitive ancestors to control or influence descendants who have moved so far beyond the concerns of the past that the warnings are not just irrelevant but actively annoying. And yet, despite these concerns, most of us would probably say that the attempt is worthwhile, even if the messages get garbled, even if the warnings are misunderstood or ignored, even if future people laugh at our monuments or tear them down or simply forget about them. The effort of reaching forward, of trying to connect across time, of caring enough about the future to attempt communication, has value. It reflects a moral imagination that extends beyond immediate self-interest, a recognition that we are part of something larger than our own lives, a willingness to take responsibility for the long-term consequences of our actions. These are good qualities, qualities we should want to cultivate and express, even if the specific results are uncertain. The ancient monument builders were doing their best with the knowledge and tools they had, and we honor them by doing the same, by trying in our turn to speak to the future, knowing that we will fail in some ways but hoping that some fragment of our intention, some echo of our concern, will make it through. In modern times, we have developed a specific form of monument that is explicitly designed to communicate with the future, the time capsule. Time capsules are containers filled with objects and information, sealed and then hidden or buried with instructions that they should be opened at some specified future date. The contents are carefully chosen to represent the time period, to give future people a snapshot of what life was like, what was considered important, what technologies were in use, what challenges were being faced. There is something charming about time capsules, something hopeful and optimistic and touchingly earnest. They represent a belief that the future will care about us, will want to know who we were, will appreciate the effort we made to reach out to them. But time capsules also reveal the limitations of trying to communicate across time. Many time capsules are lost, they are buried and the location is forgotten, or the markers are removed, or the records are misplaced. They are hidden in buildings that are torn down, or in parks that are redesigned, or in places that change so much that no one remembers anything was ever buried there. And even when time capsules are found and opened, the contents are often disappointing or baffling. Objects that seemed important at the time seem trivial or incomprehensible later. Technologies that were cutting edge are obsolete and quaint. Letters written to the future are filled with assumptions and references that make no sense to people who do not share the cultural context. The snapshot does not capture as much as the creators hoped it would, and the future people looking at the content are left with more questions than answers. This is the same problem that ancient monument builders faced, just on a smaller and more modest scale. The impulse is the same: to reach forward, to communicate, to preserve something of ourselves for the future. But the execution is difficult, and the results are uncertain. We cannot know what will be meaningful to people in the future. We cannot know what they will find interesting or important or useful. We cannot know if they will even be able to understand the forms of communication we use, whether physical objects or written language or digital files. We can only make our best guesses, include what seems most important to us, and hope that something of our intention makes it through. Perhaps the most successful time capsules are not the ones that try to be comprehensive or educational, but the ones that are simply honest and personal. A letter written by someone describing their daily life, their hopes and fears, their observations about the world around them, might communicate more across time than a carefully curated collection of important documents and representative artifacts. Because what future people are likely to care about, what we care about when we look back at the past, is not just facts and data, but the human experience, the felt sense of what it was like to be alive at a particular moment in history. And that is something that comes through more clearly in personal voices than in official histories, more clearly in small details and casual observations than in grand pronouncements and carefully composed statements. Ancient monuments sometimes contain these personal touches, graffiti or small marks or repairs that speak to individual human beings rather than grand civilizations. A worker's fingerprint pressed into clay, a carver's tool mark that shows hesitation or correction, a small personal object left as an offering or buried as part of a ritual. These are not the main monuments, not the impressive structures that dominate landscapes, but they are often the most touching, the most immediate, the most successful at crossing the gap of time and making us feel connected to the people who lived so long ago. They remind us that monuments are built by individuals, by people with hands and hearts and minds, by people who were as real and alive and complicated as we are, and that connection, that recognition of shared humanity across vast distances of time, is perhaps the most important message any monument can convey. Stone is patient. It does not hurry or worry or change its mind. It sits where it is placed and waits. For years, for centuries, for millennia, simply being stone, weathering slowly, gradually becoming smoother or rougher or more fragmented, but fundamentally remaining itself. There is something deeply calming about this patience, something that speaks to a different kind of time than the frantic, rushing pace of modern life. When you sit with a stone, when you really pay attention to it, you can feel this quality of patient endurance, this quality of not needing anything, or going anywhere, or becoming anything other than what it is. The people who built stone monuments understood this quality. They chose stone precisely because of its patience, because it would outlast wood and cloth and flesh and memory. They trusted stone to carry their messages forward because stone does not forget, does not get distracted, does not decide to do something else instead. Stone simply persists. And persistence is a form of communication in itself. The very fact that a monument is still standing thousands of years later says something important. It says that someone cared enough to build it properly, to choose materials that would last, to create something that could withstand weather and earthquakes and the passage of ages. It says that the message, whatever it was considered important enough to deserve this kind of permanence. We have mostly lost this patience in our own culture. We build with materials that are quick to work with but do not last. We create digital files that can be transmitted instantly, but can also vanish instantly. We live in a constant present, always connected, always receiving new information, never really settling into anything because there is always something new demanding our attention. And this has costs. It makes us anxious and scattered. It makes it difficult to think deeply or feel connected to longer timescales. It makes history feel irrelevant because it is old and therefore slow and therefore boring compared to the rapid-fire stimulation of the present moment. But when you stand in front of an ancient monument, when you place your hand on stone that was carved thousands of years ago, something shifts. Time slows down. The present moment expands to include the past and the future. You become aware of yourself as a temporary presence in a much longer story, a brief flicker of consciousness in a long chain of humans who have looked at these same stones and wondered about them. And this awareness is not depressing or diminishing. It is strangely freeing. It puts your own concerns in perspective. It reminds you that the urgent problems of today will eventually become history, will be looked back on from some future vantage point where they seem small and distant and manageable. It gives you access to a deeper kind of time, a time that is not measured in minutes and hours, but in generations and centuries and ages, a time that is patient and enduring and, in its own way, comforting. Many ancient monuments are aligned with astronomical events, with the rising or setting of the sun at solstices or equinoxes, with the movements of the moon, with the positions of certain stars or planets. This suggests that the people who built these monuments were deeply interested in the sky, in tracking celestial patterns, in understanding the relationship between earth and heavens. But why? Why did ancient peoples care so much about astronomy? Part of the answer is practical. The movements of the sun and moon create the cycle of day and night, the cycle of months, the cycle of seasons. For agricultural societies, knowing when to plant and when to harvest was literally a matter of life and death. Being able to predict the coming of spring, or the arrival of the rainy season, or the length of winter, was valuable knowledge that could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. But there was also something more than practicality involved. Ancient people saw the sky not just as a calendar, but as a story, a grand narrative being played out above them. The stars were not random points of light, but characters and symbols, organized into constellations that represented gods and heroes and animals and mythological events. The movements of celestial bodies were not just predictable patterns, but meaningful actions, messages from the divine realm, omens and portents that could be read by those with the knowledge to interpret them. The sky was a book, and learning to read it was a form of literacy as important as any other. When a monument was aligned with a celestial event, it was creating a connection between earth and sky, between human space and cosmic space. It was saying that this particular spot on the ground was significant, was linked to something larger than itself. It was marking a moment of alignment, when earth and heaven came together, when the ordinary became sacred. Standing in such a place at such a moment, watching the sun rise through a particular gap in the stones or illuminate a particular chamber, ancient peoples must have felt a profound sense of connection and meaning, a sense that they were participating in something timeless and important, something that linked them to their ancestors and their descendants, and to the eternal patterns of the universe itself. These alignments were also a form of knowledge preservation. A stone circle aligned with the summer solstice is a permanent marker of that event, a way of ensuring that the knowledge of when the solstice occurs is not lost even if the stories and songs that explain it are forgotten. You do not need to remember the specific date or understand the mathematics of Earth's orbit. You just need to watch where the sun rises, and the stones will tell you when you have reached the longest day. This is knowledge encoded in physical form, made tangible and reliable and accessible to anyone who knows how to look. And in a world without writing or computers or any way to store information externally, this kind of encoding was crucial. The monuments were not just memorials or temples, they were tools, instruments for tracking time, preserving knowledge, maintaining continuity across generations. One of the most striking things about ancient monuments is how many questions they raise that we cannot answer. We can measure and analyze and excavate and use all the tools of modern archaeology, and yet still be left wondering about the most basic aspects of why a monument was built, what it meant. This absence of clear answers can be frustrating for people who want certainty, who want to know the truth about the past. But there is also something valuable about living with unanswered questions, about allowing mystery to remain mysterious, about resisting the urge to fill every gap in knowledge with speculation presented as fact. Mystery invites contemplation. When we know the answer to something, we tend to stop thinking about it. It becomes settled, finished, a fact to be filed away and referred to when needed, but not actively engaged with. But when something remains mysterious, when we do not know the answer, it stays alive in our minds. We keep returning to it, keep wondering, keep noticing new details, or considering new possibilities. The mystery draws us in and keeps us engaged in a way that certainty never could. And in the case of ancient monuments, this ongoing engagement is a form of relationship with the past, a way of staying connected to the people who built these things, a way of honoring them not by claiming to fully understand them, but by continuing to wonder about them, continuing to care. There is also something honest about acknowledging what we do not know. For a long time, scholars made confident pronouncements about ancient sites, declaring that this was definitely a temple, or that was definitely a tomb, or this symbol definitely meant this thing, even when the evidence was thin or ambiguous. This created a false sense of certainty, a feeling that the past had been figured out and understood. But as archaeology has matured as a discipline, as methods have become more rigorous and interpretations more careful, there has been a shift toward acknowledging uncertainty, toward saying, we think this might mean X, but it could also mean Y, and there are aspects we simply do not understand. This is more honest, more humble, and ultimately more respectful both of the evidence and of the ancient peoples we are trying to understand. When we stand before a monument and admit that we do not know why it was built or what it meant, we are creating space for the ancient builders to remain themselves, to remain different from us, to remain people whose thoughts and beliefs and motivations might not have been the same as ours. If we are resisting the temptation to make them into versions of ourselves, to project our own values and assumptions onto them, to turn them into characters in stories we tell rather than recognizing them as people who had their own stories, their own perspectives, their own reasons for doing things that might not make sense to us because we do not share their worldview. This recognition of difference, this acceptance of mystery, is an important kind of wisdom, a willingness to let the past be past rather than trying to domesticate it and make it fit comfortably into our present understanding. Many monuments were built over such long periods of time that the people who started them never saw them finished. Stonehenge took more than 1,000 years to complete, which means that dozens of generations lived and died during its construction. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe often took centuries to build, with work continuing across multiple generations of craftsmen and planners and clergy. In some cases, the original vision was modified or lost as construction continued, as priorities shifted, as resources became scarce or abundant, as new technologies or techniques became available. The finished monument might look very different from what the original planners intended, shaped as much by accident and contingency and the accumulated decisions of many people as by any single clear design. Imagine what it would be like to work on such a project. You would be contributing to something you knew you would never see completed. You would be building for your children and grandchildren, trusting that they would continue the work, hoping that the vision would be maintained even as you yourself became too old to work, and then died and were buried while the stones you had placed continued to stand. There is something both humbling and ennobling about this kind of work. It requires a perspective that extends beyond individual benefit, a willingness to sacrifice for something larger than yourself, a faith in continuity and community, and the possibility that your contribution, however small, will matter in the long run. This multi-generational aspect of monument building also means that the monuments carry within them the accumulated labour and care of many people. Each stone was lifted by someone. Each carving was made by hands that belonged to a specific person with a specific life. Someone who woke up that morning and ate food and thought thoughts and felt emotions and then went to work on this project. When we see a finished monument, we tend to see it as a single thing, a unified whole. But it is actually thousands or millions of individual actions layered on top of each other, extending across decades or centuries, each one a small act of faith in the future, each one a small contribution to something that no individual could have created alone. There must have been moments of doubt. Surely there were people who questioned whether the effort was worth it, whether the resources devoted to building monuments could have been better used for other purposes, whether future generations would actually care or appreciate what was being done. Surely there were times when progress stalled, when resources ran out, when political or social upheavals threatened to derail the entire project, and yet the work continued, generation after generation, people choosing again and again to honour the commitment made by their ancestors, to keep building even when the reasons might have become unclear or the original purpose might have been partially forgotten. This persistence across generations is itself a kind of monument, a testament to the power of shared projects and collective identity and the bonds that connect people across time even when they never meet. When you visit an ancient monument, one of the most striking things is often the silence. These places tend to be quiet, not just because they are often located away from modern noise and bustle, but because they seem to invite quietness, to create a space where silence feels natural and appropriate. People tend to speak softly or not at all. There is a quality of reverence or respect, or simply a sense that noise would be out of place, that these spaces call for a different kind of presence than ordinary spaces do. This silence is not empty. It is full of awareness, full of the weight of time, full of the presence of all the people who have stood in this space before and felt the same sense of quiet awe. It is a silence that allows for a reflection, for turning inward, for becoming aware of your own breathing and heartbeat, for feeling yourself as a small presence in a large story. Modern life is so full of noise, of constant stimulation and information and demand on attention that we rarely experience this kind of silence. We fill every gap with music or podcasts or conversation or scrolling through screens. We are uncomfortable with quiet because it leaves us alone with our thoughts, and our thoughts can be uncomfortable or unsettling or simply unfamiliar if we are not used to listening to them. But ancient monuments create conditions where silence becomes not just acceptable but necessary. You cannot fully experience the presence of deep time while listening to music or chatting on a phone. You have to be quiet, have to be still, have to let yourself be present in the moment without distraction. And when you do this, when you allow yourself to be silent in a silent place, something shifts. You become more aware of physical sensations, of the feeling of air on skin, of the texture of stone under your hand, of the subtle movements of light as clouds pass overhead. You become more aware of your own transience, of the fact that you are here for just a brief moment while the stones have been here for millennia and will remain after you are gone. And this awareness, rather than being depressing, is often strangely peaceful. It puts things in perspective. It reminds you that your problems and worries are temporary, that life is larger than any single moment of difficulty or anxiety. Perhaps this is part of what the monument builders were trying to create, spaces that would induce this kind of quietness, this kind of reflective presence. Sacred spaces in many traditions are designed to separate people from ordinary experience, to create conditions where awareness shifts, where it becomes easier to feel connected to something transcendent or eternal, or simply larger than everyday concerns. The monuments do this through their size and permanence and age, through the way they dominate landscapes and dwarf human scale, through the mystery of their origins and purposes. They create silence not just as an absence of noise, but as a presence in itself, a quality of attention and awareness that allows for a different kind of experience than what is possible in the constant rush of modern life. Nothing lasts forever, not even stone. The monuments that have survived for thousands of years are nevertheless gradually eroding, wearing away under the relentless pressure of weather and time. Rain seeps into cracks and freezes and expands, breaking pieces off. Wind carries sand and grit that slowly abrade surfaces, smoothing carvings, wearing away details. Plants grow in crevices, their roots widening gaps, their chemical processes dissolving mineral bonds. And always there is gravity, patient and inexorable, pulling everything slowly downward, causing stones to shift and settle and eventually fall. This erosion is not dramatic. It happens so slowly that you cannot see it from year to year, sometimes not even from decade to decade. But it is happening constantly, and over long enough time scales the effects become visible. Carvings that were once sharp and clear become softened and indistinct. Edges that were once crisp become rounded. Surfaces that were once smooth become pitted and rough. Standing stones tilt and lean as the ground beneath them shifts. Structures that once stood proud and complete become ruins, partial and fragmentary, with pieces missing and scattered. There is something poignant about this slow surrender to time. The monuments were built to last forever, to resist change, to preserve messages and meanings across the ages. And they have succeeded better than almost anything else humans have made. But they are still losing the battle, still slowly being unmade by the same forces of nature that made the stone in the first place. Through eons of geological processes, the monuments are temporary after all, just temporary on a longer time scale than most human creations, lasting thousands of years instead of decades or centuries, but ultimately destined to return to dust in fragments like everything else. And yet knowing this does not diminish their achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. The fact that these structures have lasted as long as they have, that we can still see them and touch them and experience their presence thousands of years after they were built, is extraordinary. The monument builders knew surely that nothing lasts forever. They lived close to death and loss and change. They saw structures built in their own lifetimes fall into disrepair. They knew that the earth itself was not static but dynamic, subject to earthquakes and floods, and the slow reshaping of landscapes. And yet they built anyway, creating the most permanent structures they could, pushing against the inevitability of erosion and decay, asserting through stone that some things matter enough to fight for, even when you know the fight will eventually be lost. Not everyone is happy that ancient monuments exist. In some places, they are seen as burdens, expensive to maintain and preserve, taking up valuable land that could be used for farming or development, attracting tourists who bring money but also crowds and noise and the need for infrastructure. Local people who live near major monuments sometimes resent them, feel that the benefits of tourism go to outsiders while they bear the costs, feel that their own needs and concerns are secondary to the imperative to preserve the past. This tension between preservation and development, between honouring history and meeting present needs, is real and legitimate, and not easy to resolve. There are also cases where monuments represent painful histories. Colonial monuments, statues honouring slaveholders or conquerors, markers of oppression and injustice. These are not neutral objects, but symbols that continue to wound and anger people whose ancestors were victims of the systems these monuments celebrate. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to remove such monuments, to stop honouring people and events that do not deserve honour, to clear public spaces of symbols that communicate messages many people find offensive or harmful. This has led to controversy and debate about where the line should be drawn, about whether all monuments from the past should be preserved regardless of what they represent, or whether some should be removed or contextualized or relocated to museums where they can be viewed as historical artifacts rather than objects of current reverence. These debates are important and necessary. Not all monuments are equally valuable or meaningful. Not all messages from the past are worth preserving or transmitting to the future, and the people who live in the present should have a say in what monuments continue to stand in their communities, what symbols are given prominence in public spaces, what version of history is literally set in stone for all to see. The past does not automatically deserve deference. The fact that something is old does not make it sacred or untouchable. Each generation has to make its own decisions about what to preserve and what to let go, what to honour and what to repudiate, what to carry forward and what to leave behind. But even while acknowledging this, there is something to be said for erring on the side of preservation when possible, for recognising that monuments, even problematic ones, carry information and contexts that can be valuable even when the messages are uncomfortable. Removing a monument does not erase the history it represents. It might actually make it easier to forget that history, to avoid confronting the difficult truths it points to. Sometimes it is better to keep the monument but change how it is presented, to add context that explains what it represents and why it is problematic, to use it as a teaching tool rather than an object of uncritical veneration. This allows the past to remain visible and available for examination, while also making clear that visibility is not the same as approval, that we can acknowledge history without endorsing everything that happened. Perhaps the greatest gift that ancient monuments give us is a perspective on deep time, an awareness of human history as something that extends far beyond our own lifetimes, far beyond the handful of generations we might personally remember or have stories about. When you read about a monument that is 5,000 years old, when you try to comprehend that span of time, something happens in your mind. The present moment, which usually feels so overwhelmingly important and all-consuming, shrinks a bit. Your own concerns and worries, which can seem so urgent and critical, are revealed as temporary and passing. The certainties you hold, the things you assume, are permanent features of reality, are shown to be contingent and changeable, products of your particular time and place, rather than eternal truths. This perspective is not nihilistic or depressing. It doesn't mean that nothing matters or that we should not care about our lives and our choices and our efforts to make things better. Rather, it provides a kind of scale, a way of distinguishing between different kinds of importance. Some things truly are urgent and require immediate attention, but many of the things we worry about, many of the conflicts we get caught up in, many of the status competitions and social anxieties that consume our energy, are actually quite small when viewed from the perspective of deep time. They will not matter in 100 years, let alone in 1,000 or 10,000, and recognizing this can be freeing, can allow us to let go of petty concerns and focus on things that have longer-lasting significance. What kinds of things have longer-lasting significance? Acts of creation and preservation, contributions to knowledge or beauty or justice, efforts to solve genuine problems rather than just win arguments, relationships and communities that nurture and support human flourishing, work that serves needs beyond immediate self-interest. These are the things that might matter to people in the future, might be valued by descendants we will never meet, might contribute in small ways to the long unfolding story of human existence. When we act with awareness of deep time, we are more likely to make choices that we will be proud of when viewed from a future perspective, choices that align with values that transcend any particular cultural moment or temporary concern. Ancient monuments also remind us that we are part of a long chain of humans stretching back into the distant past and forward into an unimaginable future. We are not isolated individuals living disconnected lives. We are inheritors of knowledge and culture and genetic material that has been passed down through countless generations. We benefit from the efforts and sacrifices of people we never knew, people who built and preserved and created and discovered and taught, people who faced their own challenges and sorrows and joys, people who were as real and alive and complex as we are, and we in turn will pass something along to the future, will contribute our small part to the ongoing story, will be ancestors to people who will look back at us the way we look back at ancient monument builders, with curiosity and respect and a desire to understand what our lives were like and what we cared about. If ancient monuments are warnings, if they are messages from past peoples trying to tell us something important about danger or wisdom or knowledge that must not be lost, then perhaps the time has come to listen more carefully, to pay closer attention to what they might be saying. Not by engaging in wild speculation or unfounded theories about lost civilizations or ancient astronauts, but by taking seriously the basic questions they raise. What are we preserving? What are we losing? What will matter in the long run? What do we want to say to the future? And what marks are we leaving that will speak for us when we can no longer speak for ourselves? The warnings encoded in ancient monuments are not about specific events or particular dangers, so much as about the human condition itself, about the challenges every civilization faces, about the patterns that repeat across history. They warn us about the fragility of knowledge, about how easily it can be lost when not properly preserved. They warn us about the consequences of environmental destruction, about what happens when resources are depleted and systems collapse. They warn us about the dangers of forgetting, of losing track of where we came from, of severing connections with ancestors and the wisdom they struggled to accumulate. They warn us about hubris, about the temptation to believe that our civilization is different, special, immune to the forces that brought down previous societies. But they also offer something more than warnings. They offer hope. The fact that these monuments exist, that they have survived so long, that we can still encounter them and be moved by them and learn from them, shows that human efforts to reach across time can succeed, at least partially, at least sometimes. The messages may be garbled and incomplete, but they do arrive. The connection is tenuous and uncertain, but it is real. We are not alone, not isolated in our particular moment, not cut off from all that came before. We are part of a conversation that spans millennia, a conversation conducted largely in silence and mystery and the mute testimony of stones, but a conversation nonetheless, an ongoing dialogue between past and present and future about what it means to be human, what matters, what endures. We are the future that the ancient monument builders were reaching toward. We are the recipients of their messages, whether we can fully understand those messages or not. And this places a responsibility on us, an obligation to take their efforts seriously, to preserve what they created, to continue the work of connecting past and future, to think about what we in turn will leave for those who come after us. This responsibility is not burdensome if we approach it with the right spirit. It is an invitation to participate in something larger than ourselves, to be part of the long human story, to contribute our verse, as the poet says, to the ongoing poem of existence. Part of this responsibility is preservation. We need to protect ancient monuments from vandalism and pollution and neglect. We need to study them carefully and respectfully, using the best methods available while acknowledging the limits of what we can know. We need to make them accessible to people who want to experience them while also protecting them from being damaged by too many visitors or too much development. This is not always easy. It requires balancing competing needs and interests. It requires resources and commitment and long-term thinking. But it is important work, work that serves not just the past but also the future, ensuring that the monuments will still be there for people hundreds or thousands of years from now to encounter and wonder about. Another part of this responsibility is interpretation. We need to think carefully about how we explain ancient monuments, what stories we tell about them, what meanings we attribute to them. We need to be honest about what we know and what we do not know, avoiding the temptation to make confident claims based on thin evidence or personal preference. We need to listen to multiple perspectives, including the perspectives of indigenous peoples and local communities who may have their own traditions and understandings that are different from academic interpretations. We need to be open to revising our ideas as new evidence emerges or new ways of thinking become available. And we need to present these sites in ways that invite contemplation and respect rather than just consumption, that encourage visitors to engage deeply rather than just take selfies and check boxes on tourist itineraries. But perhaps the most important part of this responsibility is to learn from the monuments, to take seriously what they are trying to tell us about human nature and civilizational challenges and the importance of thinking across long timescales. We need to ask ourselves whether we are being good ancestors, whether the things we are building and the marks we are leaving will be things that future generations will be grateful for or will curse us for. We need to consider what knowledge we are preserving and what we are allowing to slip away. We need to think about sustainability and long-term consequences, about the difference between what benefits us in the short term and what will serve humanity in the long run. These are not easy questions, and answering them requires the kind of deep thinking and perspective taking that ancient monuments invite us to practice. As this long meditation on ancient monuments and their possible meanings draws toward its close, it becomes clear that definitive answers are not really possible, and perhaps not even desirable. The monuments stand in mystery, and mystery is where they belong, where they do their most important work. If we completely understood them, if we could read their messages with perfect clarity, if we knew exactly why they were built and what they meant, something valuable would be lost. The wandering would stop, the engagement would end, they would become mere facts, things to be known and filed away, rather than living questions that invite ongoing contemplation and relationship. There is a kind of wisdom in accepting that some things remain unknown, that not everything can or should be explained, that mystery is not a problem to be solved but a gift to be received. Ancient monuments are gifts in this sense, offerings from the past that keep giving across millennia because they never quite give up their secrets, never quite allow themselves to be fully comprehended and exhausted. They remain other, remain strange, remain invitations to wonder rather than objects of complete understanding. And this quality of remaining mysterious is part of how they work as monuments, part of how they continue to matter and command attention and provoke thought generation after generation. So perhaps the warning, if there is one, is not about any specific danger or any particular piece of knowledge that must be preserved. Perhaps the warning is simpler and more fundamental. Remember that you do not know everything. Remember that the past is not transparent, not fully accessible, not easily understood. Remember that the people who came before you were different from you, thought differently, believed differently, had concerns and priorities that might not match yours. Remember to approach the unknown with humility and curiosity and patience. Remember that some questions do not have answers, or at least not answers that you can access with the tools currently available to you. Remember to be comfortable with mystery, with ambiguity, with the limits of your knowledge and understanding. And remember to rest. Remember that you are part of a pattern that is much larger and older than you, that the work of living and building and preserving and creating has been going on for thousands of years before you were born and will continue for thousands of years after you die, that your contribution, however important it feels to you in the moment, is just one small thread in an enormous tapestry, and that this is not a diminishment but a liberation, a release from the burden of thinking that everything depends on you, that you must solve all problems and answer all questions and carry the entire weight of past and future on your own shoulders. The stones still stand, weathered and worn, but standing nonetheless, marking landscapes with the presence of deep time, speaking in their silent language to anyone willing to listen. The pyramids rise from desert sands, the stone circles crown their hills, the Moai watch over their lonely island. The ancient cities sleep beneath jungle canopy, and all of these monuments scattered across the world, created by different peoples at different times for different reasons, share a common quality. They endure. They persist. They remain patient and solid and real, anchors in the rushing stream of time, reminders that humans have always tried to create something that lasts, to speak to the future, to leave marks that matter. Tonight, as you lie in darkness, as your breathing slows and your body relaxes and consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, you can carry with you the image of these stones, these ancient patient stones that have weathered so many storms and witnessed so many sunrises, that have stood still while civilizations rose and fell around them, that have outlasted languages and empires and entire ways of life. You can feel yourself connected to them not because you built them or even fully understand them, but simply because you are human, and they are human creations, products of hands and minds and hearts that were fundamentally like yours, people who felt joy and sorrow and wonder and fear, people who looked up at stars and felt small and tried to create something that would make their smallness matter, that would give permanence to the fleeting moments of their lives. And as you drift towards sleep, you can let go of the need to understand everything, the need to have answers and explanations and clear meanings. You can rest in the mystery the way the stones rest in the landscape, simply being, simply present, without needing to be anything other than what you are. The questions remain, the puzzles persist, the monuments continue to invite interpretation and speculation and wonder, but none of that requires anything from you now. You have taken this gentle journey through time and stone. You have walked these quiet paths through memory and speculation and imagination. And now it is time simply to rest, to let your mind grow still and soft, to allow sleep to come naturally and easily, knowing that the stones will still be there tomorrow, still standing, still silent, still waiting with their patient and eternal mystery. The story of ancient monuments is the story of humans reaching across time, trying to communicate, trying to preserve, trying to warn or teach or simply say, "We were here, we mattered, remember us." And the story continues, will always continue, as long as there are people to look at old stones and wonder what they mean. As long as there are minds curious about the past and hearts that feel the pull of connection across generations, you are part of that story now, have been part of it from the moment you began listening to these words, and you will carry it with you in some form even as you sleep, even as conscious thought dissolves and dreams take over and the journey continues in different realms entirely. So sleep now, gently and deeply, with the image of standing stones and pyramids and ancient markings slowly fading from your mind like stars fading in the dawn, becoming fainter and fainter until they are gone but not really gone, still there somewhere in the background of awareness, still holding their place, still standing their long watch over landscapes transformed by time, still speaking in whispers too soft to hear but somehow felt nonetheless, vibrations of meaning that travel across millennia and arrive here now, in this moment of drowsy comfort, this moment of letting go, this moment of drifting finally and fully into the deep and peaceful silence, that has been waiting for you all along, the silence that is rest and renewal, and the gentle dissolution of all the day's concerns into the soft and welcoming darkness where nothing is required and everything is allowed, and there is only the slow rhythm of breathing and the gradual surrender to sleep, to dreams, to the long night's journey through realms where time moves differently or does not move at all, where the stones have been waiting all along, patient and kind and eternal, watching over you as you finally rest.